Okay, we're going to move it right along now. For our next speaker, be introducing Mr. Nick Redfern. Nick is an accomplished investigative journalist and an author, of course, tackling not only the subject of UFOs, but also many other paranormal topics. He is a familiar face to many, having appeared on numerous television shows, including Ancient Aliens, I particularly like that one, and MUFON's Hangar 1 on the History Channel. That's a good one too. What will he say about the government, what they really know? Well, why don't we find out? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Nick Redfern.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, everybody. Everybody having a good time? Good? Good. I'm glad you said yes. What I'm going to do for you today, bear in mind the subject matter of the conference is what does the government know? I'm going to talk to you about the Men in Black mystery. Now, of course, most people's perceptions on the Men in Black and who they are or what they may be, largely comes from the movies, and that's certainly the case for the general public. You know, they think the Men in Black are Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, and which actually isn't the case. What makes the real Men in Black mystery so weird is that there appears to be actually more than one category of Men in Black, which might kind of sound a bit strange when you think about it. The Men in Black are the Men in Black, right? Well, no, they're actually not. There's multiple potential groups, all with different agendas, and that's what makes the subject so fascinating and intriguing, but also difficult to reconcile and determine when it comes to understanding their true nature. Now, as I said, most people's perceptions, from the movies at least, is that the Men in Black work from some sort of government agency, or possibly like a rogue shadow group that operates outside of the regular government and which most people in government don't know anything about. And that certainly is part of the mystery. But then there's this opposite angle as well, where we get a lot of reports where the Men in Black, as bizarre as it sounds, don't even sound human. They almost look like alien-human hybrids is the best way to describe them. And yet they dress like the government guys as well, so the black suits and even today, the weirder Men in Black still wear the old style black fedoras that they wore back in the 40s and 50s. So on the theme of what does the government know, I'm going to talk about the cases where we can trace the mystery back to government agencies, but also on the angle of the government, where government agencies have actually said to each other, who are the Men in Black? You know, we've heard these stories about these guys in black suits knocking on doors. Who are they? So, in other words, although part of the mystery might be explainable through the government, to a degree they're baffled by this other side as well, which I'm going to bring up from the beginning because that's how the story really begins. Now, I've written 3 books altogether on the Men in Black mystery, and that's the most recent one, called Men in Black, very original title. And all the research I've uncovered over the years does push things down these different categories rather than one. And I think, you know, if it was just one person saying, well, I was visited by the government and, you know, all the other reports are in the other category, you could just make a case that it was just one phenomenon. But it's actually not. As I said, there are multiple groups at work. Now, we have to begin with the Men in Black mystery in 1952. Now, although the so-called modern era of ufology began in 1947 with Kenneth Arnold's sighting over Washington State, and then you had the famous Roswell incident right here in New Mexico, what's interesting but also puzzling is that for the most part, Men in Black encounters didn't begin when the modern era of ufology began in 47. It was about 4 or 5 years later, so we're talking 51, 52, that kind of period. And the man who really kicked it all off was a guy named Albert Bender. Albert Bender in 1951 established a UFO group called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. And he lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut, And Bender was kind of an unusual, weird guy. He was heavily into UFOs, but he was deeply involved in some sort of seriously weird occult stuff. I mean, you know, sort of really dark occult research and trying to summon up supernatural entities and things like this. And on top of that, he lived in this creepy old house that looked kind of like a cross between Norman Bates' mother's house in Psycho and the Addams family's house. It's kind of, and I'm not exaggerating, that's kind of what it looked like. And of all places, Albert Bender rented a room in the attic, or he rented the attic, I should say. And he plastered the walls with all these pictures of like demonic heads and things like that, and created what he called his paranormal altar, where he read a lot of these ancient manuscripts to try and summon up like, demonic entities and supernatural creatures. And he may have succeeded. Bender, as I said, created this group called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. And unlike a lot of the very early UFO research groups, it took off not just locally, but massively and internationally, to the point where eventually he had around about 2,000 subscribers to his Flying Saucer magazine. Now, all was going well for a couple of years, but then suddenly, without warning, Bender shut down the IFSB. And a lot of his friends and colleagues thought, you know, this was just a publicity stunt, that he's going to come back. You know, kind of like when your favourite band says we're going on tour for the final time, so you better come and see us. And then 5 years later, they're back again, you know, because somebody's offered them a good deal. That's what people thought Bender was going to do. But it actually isn't what happened at all. He closed the group down and briefly mentioned to one guy named Gray Barker. And if you can see the cover of the book there, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, written by Gray Barker in 1956. Barker's book tells the story of how and why Bender got out of the UFO mystery. And Bender said that one particular day he was out walking, just doing some shopping, and he saw this guy who seemed to be following him, dressed in a black suit, black skinny tie, black fedora. He kind of looked like something, bear in mind the time frame, like out of a 1950s era gangster movie, something along those lines. Didn't think too much about it beyond the fact that he was clearly being followed. And this happened several times. Also, Bender was heavily into science fiction movies, horror movies, and spent his Saturday nights going to see the latest releases at the local theatre. And he claimed to have seen these guys in black suits watching him there as well. And he told this to Gray Barker. Gray Barker wrote this book in '56, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, which has sort of gone down in UFO history because it's the first book ever written on the Men in Black mystery. You can see them, 3 of them there. And so Barker assumed from the brief data that Bender gave to him that the Men in Black were from the government. But in 1962, Bender came out of very brief retirement, he retired, but came out of it very briefly to write his own book, which Gray Barker published, called Flying Saucers and the Three Men. Now, in Bender's book, in contrast to Barker's book, which portrayed the MIB as from the government, Bender's book reads far less like the X-Files and far more like Edgar Allan Poe meets H.P. Lovecraft meets the X-Files, in the sense that his Men in Black were nothing like you would expect from the government. For example, he claimed that typically they would literally sort of materialise, he said, in the attic. He would feel kind of lightheaded and dizzy, he'd have a sense of vertigo, and he said the room was filled with this odour like brimstone, like sulphur, which is sort of a classic aspect of a lot of supernatural activity. And he would literally sort of stumble and have to lay down on the bed. And he said suddenly he would see these 3 shadowy figures appear in the room, not unlike they're portrayed on the cover there of Barker's book. There's a reason why they're portrayed like that, is because that's how they were. They were sort of shadowy rather than substantial where you could see them. And he said they had these sort of fiery, glowing red eyes, and spoke to him telepathically and warned him to get out of the UFO subject. So, in other words, we have Barker's book, which came out in '56, that really laid the foundations, if you like, for the notion of the Men in Black being from the government. But then, ironically, the person who was the subject of the book said, well, actually, that isn't what happened. And the reason why he called the book Flying Saucers and the Three Men is because most witnesses to Men in Black activity are visited by a trio of Men in Black. Occasionally it's one, more often two, but usually three. So that, hence the title, Flying Saucers and the Three Men. And that really, as I said, began in the 1950s and laid the foundations for what today has become popularly known as the Men in Black. Now, into the 1960s, things continued in that same pathway. That's Brad Steiger, who's a very well-known, famous author on all sorts of paranormal phenomena, who I'm sure many of you know Brad's name. Well, Brad had a number of run-ins with the Men in Black over the years, which to this day continues to ensure that he still takes a deep interest in the subject. And actually, in the new book, Brad provided a paper for me about his own experiences with the Men in Black in the 1960s. And again, they sound very much like Albert Bender's extremely weird Men in Black. For example, at the height of Brad's research, he began to find that a number of his friends were being visited by the Men in Black, and they were essentially threatening his friends and telling his friends to tell Steiger to stop this research. And perhaps the most chilling story is that a friend of Brad's was on vacation in London, England in the mid-60s. And, you know, he's doing the tourist thing, going to Buckingham Palace, the Tower of London, places like that. Everywhere he was going, he would see this trio of guys following him. And what was strange was that, you know, they had the black suits, the black fedoras, but they were only about 5 feet tall. You know, their skin was sort of, you know, the colour of this sheet of paper. They looked anemic and just not well. And everywhere he went, he would see them, sort of 100 yards behind or 100 feet behind, just shadowing him. He got back to his hotel room one night, went to bed, and something just prompted him to wake up in the middle of the night. Went to the window, and there were these 3 guys stood underneath the street light, just looking up at his hotel room window. And this really freaked out Brad's friend, and to the point where he decided to cut his vacation short. Well, before he actually left London, the 3 guys approached him and said, "You're a friend of Brad Steiger, aren't you?" It was more of a statement than a question, and he said, "Well, yeah." And they said, "Tell him we will visit him at Christmas time," which kind of sounds, you know, a little bit ominous. But fortunately, Brad didn't get a visitation, but it was enough to make him realise that somebody somewhere was trying to intimidate him. And it was during this period as well that Brad had a lot of, for example, telephone interference and strange noises on the line, what sounded like chattering voices in a foreign language, but which couldn't be deciphered. And of course, you know, some people might well become intimidated by this, you know, the idea of getting hang-up phone calls at 2 or 3 in the morning from the Men in Black. And you know, as I said, although it didn't, you know, Brad's not the sort of person to back down from something like that, which is good. But it did make him realise that, wow, when you get into this subject, you can find yourself on the receiving end of these kind of events. Now, people often ask me, to what extent do we have evidence that the Men in Black actually exist? The answer to that question is, well, it depends on how you view the evidence. Now, that's a guy named Tim Beckley. Now, in the mid-1960s, Tim, along with a colleague, Jim Mosley. Jim, unfortunately, died a couple of years ago, but Tim is still active in the field today. And back in the 1960s, there was a husband and wife UFO team, Jack and Mary Robinson, and they lived in Jersey City. And Jack had a day job, and Mary stayed at home. And on a number of occasions in late 1968, Mary reported or phoned Tim to say that every morning there was this weird guy in a black suit stood in the recess of the doorway opposite their apartment, just sort of staring, almost zombified, if you like, at their window. And not surprisingly, it's, you know, it disturbed her. And she phoned Jack, and Jack said, well, I'm at work, you know, I can't come back. So that's why she phoned Tim. And this MIB was there the next morning, for 4 days in a row. We very often don't get that, the main reason being that that's why they're so elusive. They turn up once and then they're gone. So Tim said to Jim, well, you know, if this guy has been here 4 days running, maybe we can see he's going to be there for a 5th day. So they anticipated the possibility that he would still be in the recess of this doorway, staring sort of ominously at the Robinsons' apartment and freaking Mary out. And so they drove over to Jersey City. It was typically every morning he would be there around about 8 o'clock. Bear in mind it was the rush hour, so what happened, Tim was driving and Jim leaned out the window, and sure enough there was the guy, and he managed to snap one picture of him, which the reproduction isn't great, but you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. Now, I'm not sure, depending on where you're sitting, I've got a blow up of it in a minute, but he's right on the left-hand side there. Hang on, get my finger. You can see he's got like a fedora hat. It almost looks like, if you look at his eyes, it doesn't look like he's necessarily got sunglasses on. It almost looks like he's got a Zorro kind of mask on or something like that. And so they took the photograph, and we just put the blow up on. Now, as I said, you know, we lose a bit of the, you know, the pixels on it, but again, he's got the fedora, at least some sort of glasses on, and it looks like with his hand he might have black gloves on as well, and that's something we get in a lot of Men in Black reports as well, is that they're wearing the black gloves. And, you know, although he's just looking out, he does kind of have like an eerie, hypnotic, zombified stance, you know, just staring outwards. And that's exactly what Mary said, that he would just stare intently at their window for like 15 minutes. So Jim and Tim quickly parked around the corner, came back, but he was gone. And that's something else that Men in Black are very good at, is being extremely elusive. And we've got a few photographs like that, which, you know, I have to admit, they're open to interpretation. Is it a man in black, or is it just happened to be a guy in a black suit? You know, which is a different thing. But the fact that he was there for 5 days, that's the whole reason why Jim and Tim went out there. So I think that could actually be one of the few genuine photographs we've got of a real man in black. Now, the guy on the right, John Keel, on the left, that's Greg Bishop, a UFO researcher, some of you may know. John Keel got involved with the Men in Black mystery predominantly when we had the Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in the 1960s. Now, Keel was someone who recognised that a lot of the UFO phenomenon seemed to straddle and cross over into certain paranormal aspects as well. It wasn't just nuts and bolts phenomena. And Keel began to experience the same sort of things that Brad Steiger had, like weird telephone calls. He would check into hotels in Point Pleasant, and the Men in Black would phone him in the middle of the night. You know, he hadn't given the hotel information out to anybody, but somebody got the information. Now, for people who may not know or be overly familiar with the Mothman story, in the 60s, that's sort of a cartoonish version that a friend of mine did. But the story is that in the mid to late 60s, there were reports of this flying, strange winged creature that became known as Mothman. And sightings culminated with the collapse of the Silver Bridge in Point Pleasant in December 67. The bridge collapsed into the Ohio River, killing literally dozens of people. And a lot of people associated the deaths with the presence of the Mothman, which, you know, its name kind of sounds comic book-like. But in reality, the creature is more of like a shadowy, wraith-like entity. And when the Mothman sightings were at their height, so were the Men in Black reports. And again, they were these sort of little guys, 5 feet tall, sort of creepy and strange looking, which some people perceived as coming from the government. There was like a strange story that the government was recruiting people who had very pale skin and they couldn't exceed 5 feet in height, which you know, it's a very strange rumour, which I don't buy at all. I think it was just presented to try and rationalise why the Men in Black look so strange. But they clearly weren't from the government. And as I said, Keel got involved, and the sightings were associated of the Men in Black with the Mothman mystery. So, you know, we see the Men in Black turning up not just in straightforward UFO encounters, but also in cases like this, sort of real high strangeness cases where you have bizarre creatures linked with the mystery as well. Which all brings us to Men in Black at Loch Ness, of all places. That's an old drawing or painting of a plesiosaur, one of the theories that's been put forward for the Loch Ness Monster. Now, in 1974, there was a very famous or infamous and weird encounter with a man in black, reported by a guy named Ted Holliday. And Ted Holliday was a researcher of the Loch Ness Monster and the phenomenon. And he started out thinking, well, the creatures are probably animals unknown to science, or something that may have survived extinction, like a plesiosaur, or just something we don't know about. But Holliday, like a lot of investigators of things like Mothman and some of these other strange creatures, began to have weird synchronicities at Loch Ness. And he actually came to believe that the phenomenon, whatever the Loch Ness Monster is, was more paranormal than it was a flesh and blood animal. And at the height of his research in '74, he was on the shores of Loch Ness one day and had that feeling that we all have at some point or another, where you think, you know, you're in the line at the checkout and you think somebody's watching you behind, you turn around and somebody is watching, you know, from 100 feet away. We all have that sensation now and again. And that's exactly what Ted Holliday did. He turned around and there was this guy just dressed totally in black, actually like black leather. He had like a black motorcycle helmet on as well. And he was just staring intently at him, and Ted Holliday had this intense sense of fear from this MIB, who suddenly there was this sort of a gust of wind and he literally vanished, and I do mean sort of literally. What was weird is that Holliday every year would take his vacation at the same time, check into the same hotel, and he realised the next year, very same location to the day, because he took his vacation the same week every year. He had a serious and near fatal heart attack, and as the ambulance guys were stretchering him away, he realised that it was the exact same spot where the Man in Black had been seen 12 months earlier. So that was sort of like a really ominous kind of, you know, almost like the ultimate warning. Now, people sometimes ask me, well, we get so many reports of the Men in Black from the 40s, from the 50s, from the 60s. Do we still get reports to this day? Well, yeah, we do. I mean, the new Men in Black book I've got out probably has 15 reports from the 2000s alone. One of the more interesting ones comes from a good friend of mine. It's Marie Jones. Some of you may know Marie. She's written a lot of very good books on various aspects of UFOs, paranormal phenomena, things like that. And in the 1990s, Marie lives in San Diego, and she set up an abduction support group for people who'd had abduction experiences. So in other words, they weren't investigating abductions, but they were lending support and helping people, sort of like a round table situation. And no sooner had they set the group up, and they started to experience things. Marie's friend lived in sort of an isolated area with woods surrounding it, and she reported seeing these strange characters on the fringes of the property late at night, not just dressed in black suits, but like old-style black trench coats and the fedoras, and she got very disturbed by it, as she would. Now, Marie didn't get that, but what Marie got was that, in many cases, I guess, many respects, even worse, she got late-night phone calls, early hours phone calls, from this robotic voice telling her things about her own bedroom where she was sleeping at the time. You know, she had a phone by the side of the bed. Even talking about the title of the book that was on the bedside table, as if whoever this person or entity was, they had the ability to know what was going on in her room. And of course, this quite naturally terrified Marie, and both her and her friend eventually decided that enough was enough, and they elected to get out of the UFO, well, not the UFO subject, but the abduction support group. And when they did that, all the Men in Black stuff came to a halt. It never happened again. So clearly, I think they'd hit on something. What it was, we don't know, but it was certainly something enough to make even Marie back away from it. All of which brings us to the theories for the Men in Black. I just need to check how long we've got because I don't want to run over into Nick. So, but yeah, as I said, we have the initial theory that everybody accepts, I guess, or assumes is probably a better term, that they come from the government, the Pentagon, somewhere like that. Now, there are a few cases on record where we can trace these reports back to government agencies where people have been legitimately visited in the 50s and 60s by people like the FBI and the CIA. And we know this because the files have surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act. And at the time, the witnesses said, these people turned up in black suits and fedoras. But that's how all the guys dressed back in the 40s and 50s, even in the 60s. And so were these government people turning up in black suits and fedoras actually Men in Black? Or were they assumed to be the Men in Black because the real Men in Black dressed the same? So I think we can make a case that a small percentage of the Men in Black are from the government. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, there are also Freedom of Information documents where the FBI, for example, the Air Force, were sending memos back to each other saying, have you heard about these reports of these so-called Men in Black? People are being sort of threatened and they posed as military personnel and posed as FBI agents. We don't know who they are. Do you know? And the Air Force would say, well, we've heard about them, but we don't know either. So in other words, you have a lot of people in the UFO community pointing the finger at the government, but then you have the government talking to each other saying, who the hell are the Men in Black? So in other words, although there may well be some sort of deeply buried group in government that does know or does coordinate some of these MIB investigations, for the most part, it's not the government. Whether or not the government actually knows, or I think it's more likely they suspect and believe there is this weirder phenomenon, but I think they're very unclear in terms of what it actually means and represents. One of the more interesting theories that's been put forward by a friend of mine, Joshua P. Warren, who's a well-known ghost investigator. Josh wonders if the theory that they could be time travelers. Now, granted, it's a hypothetical theory, but it's kind of an entertaining and an interesting one. It might explain why they dress in the old suits and the black fedoras. I mean, Josh suggested, just hypothetically of course, let's say 5,000 years from now there's been some huge cataclysm on the planet and our civilization's gone and there's just fragments and memories from this period. Well, let's say that, one of those fragments is just a few old tattered magazines from the 50s and they can see how the people in that era dressed. So they come back assuming that they're getting the clothing right, not realising how quickly our fashions change. It's reliant, of course, upon whether or not time travel is actually achievable and legitimate. But it's an intriguing theory because sometimes the Men in Black, when they turn up at people's homes, they ask people, what time is it? Which sounds a strange question to ask. But they might literally ask him, what time is it, rather than what hour of the day is it? Can it explain the phenomenon? Well, as I said, it can, I guess, if time travel is feasible. So if we can prove one day that there are time travelers, or potentially could be, that might explain a component of the MIB puzzle. That's a guy named Ray Boucher, who used to be a state director for MUFON in Nebraska, but he retired and then just does his own research. Ray is of the opinion, as some people in ufology are, it's a controversial theory that aspects of the phenomenon are literally demonic. And that's what Ray thinks. He thinks these things sort of masquerade as Men in Black, but they're sort of like a demonic power trying to sort of take over the person and ruin their lives. And it is a fact that Albert Bender, the guy who really kicked all this off in the beginning, Albert Bender did have his life ruined. His health suffered badly at the height of these Men in Black encounters, both physically and psychologically. And he developed a weird obsession and a fear that he was going to develop cancer, and cut himself off from all his friends, and essentially went through almost like a psychotic attack, so to speak, until he backed away from the subject, as I said, and then decided that he'd had enough of it all. Talking to a couple of people outside earlier, that one of the strangest things is that I've got perhaps 5 or 6 reports on file where people have been visited by the Men in Black, but where there was no UFO component at all, but they've been dabbling with Ouija boards and things like that. And they were visited, and a couple of them felt with hindsight. And again, it depends on your belief systems into, conjuring up entities from other realities. But they felt that they'd sort of opened portals and doorways to allow these creepier looking MIB to come through. And we also have vampire parallels. That's an old piece of artwork of a vampire. Now, the most interesting one is that you'd imagine that if the Men in Black are going to turn up on your doorstep late at night and they want to silence you, they might even think about sort of knocking the door down, kicking the door down, and slamming you against the wall, that kind of thing. They actually don't. They knock on the door, and very often the person feels like they've almost been rendered into an altered state, as if their regular sort of common sense factors have gone out of, somehow been taken out of their normal stance, so to speak, to where, the door knocks at midnight. Most of us, you wouldn't open the door at midnight if you looked through the spy hole and there's sort of 3 creepy looking little guys in fedoras. But people do. But the Men in Black stand patiently on the doorstep and they wait to be invited in, and they don't come in until they're invited. That kind of ties in with the old folklore of vampires not entering your home until you invite them in. And of course, the other bigger parallel is that, a lot of people said the Men in Black look dead. They look pale, they look sick, and they're dressed in black, and they come out at night. So you can see how the vampire parallels have developed in that particular issue. And so, this is one of the more controversial theories. Could it be that perhaps some old legends of vampires could have been centuries-old visitations from the Men in Black way back when? Because there are also stories of alchemists, people who claiming to have been able to transform base metals like tin and things like that into precious metals like gold. There are a number of stories in recorded history of alchemists being visited by mysterious figures in black. And whereas today's Men in Black turn up in black cars, they turned up like in a horse and cart, or on the back of a horse, something like that. So there are interesting parallels. Now, finally we come to the issue of Men in Black and synchronicities. Now, a lot of people who get involved in the UFO subject and paranormal phenomena begin to experience weird synchronicities. And for people who may not be aware, synchronicity is like a meaningful coincidence where something seems to occur in your life that appears to be a coincidence, but it's so strange, so weird, it's almost as if it's been designed to occur. And I've actually had several of these when I've been investigating the Men in Black mystery, and it's happened so many times at the exact same period that I don't think it is a coincidence. Now, when I was putting the final stages to the new book, a really weird thing happened. It was actually on a Friday morning, and this was back in July of this year, because in publishing world today, they get a book out really quickly. It was a July Friday morning, and I was sitting in my office, and I opened up the Word document to have one last read of it before it went to the publisher for proofreading and then publication. Literally as I opened the Word document, I had a bang come from one of the other rooms. I thought, what was that? And I walked into the bedroom, and what it actually was, it was a framed picture I've got on the wall of an original letter that Albert Bender sent to one of his friends back in 1953 on the Men in Black mystery. Now in that room I've got like 14 or 15 pieces of artwork of Bigfoot, UFOs, you name it. But for a picture of for a picture to fall off the wall containing a letter from Albert Bender, the guy who began the UFO mystery, and for it to fall on the ground, on the carpet and shatter at the same time I opened the Word document, that was weird. That was just really weird. That's one of several things that have happened when I've been researching the Men in Black mystery, all of which brings us to another one. Now you might wonder what a picture of me leaning against a gravestone has to do with the Men in Black. Well, when I tell you whose grave it actually is, you'll wonder even more. That's actually the grave of Clyde, as in Bonnie and Clyde, the famous gangsters. And I live just outside Dallas, and Clyde's grave, that's it there, is just actually in a little innocuous cemetery in the middle of nowhere in Dallas. And what happened was that my dad was over for Christmas, and we're actually talking on that morning about the Men in Black mystery. And so, even in the car on the way down to see the grave, because every time he comes over, he wants to see somewhere new. So I said, well, I'll take you to Bonnie and Clyde's graves. So we're in the car talking about the Men in Black, got there, got some pictures taken by Clyde's grave. As you can see, people put flowers out and all sorts of stuff. And next to Clyde's grave is his brother's grave. Now his brother's name is Marvin Ivanbarrow, and that's his grave, M-I-B. That's all his gravestone is. It doesn't actually say anywhere Marvin Ivanbarrow. It just says M period, I period, B period, you know, just like in the movies. Now, could all this be coincidence? Well, sure it could. But it sort of happened so many times. Begin to think that, you know, reality isn't really what it appears to be. And that's to sort of say, you know, are we living in some sort of unreality world? Some people think the Men in Black may be something along the lines of the agents in the Matrix movies. They're almost like a program that's sent out to perform a specific task. So, in conclusion, I don't think for the most part that the Men in Black are from the government, but I think from a few snippets of data here and there, information and some of the things that have surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act, there are people in government who know there's a real unknown Men in Black mystery, and who or what they are, all we can sort of say for sure is that they're intimately linked to the UFO phenomenon, but they seem also deeply connected to a wealth of other mysteries as well, as we've seen, like the Loch Ness Monster, Mothman, Ouija boards, vampire parallels, things like this. So there is a real Men in Black phenomenon, but it's not necessarily what most people think it is. I got reports from the US, all across Europe, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Canada, Australia. Interestingly enough, I've never got any from from South America. Now there are a few reports, but I haven't personally got any. One of the strangest ones I got from Puerto Rico was in 2005. I went out there with a film crew from Canada called Red Star Films. While we were out there, we were actually there to investigate and make a documentary on the Chupacabra, which is, you know, where the original Chupacabra sightings were made. And one of the people we interviewed was a rancher whose animals had supposedly been attacked by this Chupacabra type creature. And as we interviewed the guy, he said the strangest thing of all was not the attacks on his animals by this weird creature, but what happened the following day. And he said a man and a woman in black turned up on the doorstep and essentially threatened him not to talk about this Chupacabra encounter. And he described the Men in Black and the woman in black as exactly as people were talking about the MIB in the 50s. Black suits, very pale, and just looking kind of creepy and weird. Now, I'm not, you know, I can never prove this, but I mean, I'm pretty sure that this rancher in this little village in the El Yunque rainforest in Puerto Rico probably never read, you know, the books of Gray Barker or Albert Bender. And yet he was describing perfectly what they were talking about 60 years ago. And the women in black component of this mystery is one that I'm actually working on a book on that right now as well. It's one a lot of people aren't aware of, but the women in black, they're actually, I won't say there are many reports as Men in Black, but there are significant numbers, and particularly from the Mothman period when John Keel was doing his research. In many of the women in black reports, they turn up and they pose as census takers. And so they ask questions, you know, along the lines of what's the family income, how many rooms in the house, how many family members. And then it starts to get into weirder areas where they ask questions along the lines of, for example, have you had any strange dreams? Do UFOs mean anything to you? And the person usually has had a UFO experience, and then they think, well, how on earth, why is this person bringing this up when just 2 weeks ago I had an encounter with a UFO? So they begin to realise that things aren't quite right, and they usually ask the woman in black to leave. But as I said, they're exactly like the men in black, and although it's sort of an issue that's gone under the radar as well. But one of the things I do talk about in the new book, which I think is sort of very relevant to the Men in Black mystery, is the controversy surrounding what's become known as the black-eyed children, which many of you might have heard of. And in many respects, it's sort of even creepier than the Men in Black. For those who aren't aware of it, the black-eyed children phenomenon, well, it first began to be reported in the sort of mid-2000s, but we've got reports that now predate that by decades in some cases. And so it pushes things back far into the distant past. But typically, they're like the Men in Black. They turn up on people's doorsteps late at night. They look the same. They've got very pale skin. And in the same way that the Men in Black wear black suits and fedoras, well, the black-eyed children wear black hoodies. So there's even like a hat component or a head covering. And with hindsight, I think a lot of this is done to try and camouflage how they look. Everybody who's got close to the Men in Black has said that if you passed them on the street late at night, and you take a good look at them, you wouldn't notice too much. But if you get too close to them, they have, like I said, this waxy white skin. It's almost like glossy. And one of the people described why it was so weird was because they couldn't tell how old this person was. Was he sort of 50 or was he 30 or was he 70? But the skin was like the texture and appearance of a baby, which would look really weird. And that's kind of the same with the black-eyed children. Their skin is sort of almost like what they call like porcelain white, and just extremely smooth. And like the Men in Black, they try and find every way to get into the house. The Men in Black, granted they wait to be invited, the black-eyed children ask, can we use the telephone? We've got to phone our parents. Can you loan us some money? We're lost. That kind of thing. For the most part, people haven't, as far as I know at least, no one's ever let them in, because when they catch sight of these completely black eyes, not surprisingly, they slam the door on them. And when I say completely black eyes, we're not just talking about the middle, we're talking about the entirety of the eye. And there's no doubt that there are clear-cut parallels between the women in black, the black-eyed children, the Men in Black. And another issue that surfaced in the last few years, which many of you may have heard of as well, is the so-called shadow people. Shadow people are people wake up in the middle of the night, feeling paralysed, unable to move, and they have this sense of a threatening or menacing presence in the room. And it's become known as the shadow person. Well, within the shadow people research, there's like a subcategory known as the Hat Man. And as you can probably guess from its name, it's like a shadowy figure, but it wears a fedora. And so a lot of researchers of all these different phenomena are now coming around to the idea that the Men in Black, the black-eyed children, the women in black, the shadow people, the Hat Man, they're all an aspect of one bigger phenomenon. Of course, the big question is, what is the phenomenon? And certainly with the reports I get, for every one report I get of a man in black with a government connection, I easily get 10 or 15 which are sort of just really creepy with a lot of paranormal overtones attached to them as well. Now, sometimes, I give a lecture at a UFO conference and people don't want to hear that. They want to hear it's the government or they're aliens. But I can only sort of tell you what the witnesses tell me. And the witnesses are suggesting these, as I said, these things are far less X-Files and far more H.P. Lovecraft. But they seem to have an interest and an impact on the UFO phenomenon. Of course, that then begs the question, well, what does that tell us about the UFO phenomenon? Is that also sort of tied in with other issues as well? And I would say yes, because we do get a lot of reports where UFOs have been seen at the same time and location as Bigfoot. A friend of mine, Stan Gordon, wrote a book called Silent Invasion a few years ago about a Bigfoot UFO wave in Pennsylvania in '73, which was also dominated by people who'd seen the Man in Black. You know, they turned up and warned them not to talk about Bigfoot, you know, which kind of sounds really bizarre. So I think we're still, although the Men in Black mystery's been around for nearly sort of 70 years, I think we're still in the early stages of trying to understand what the Men in Black actually are. And of course, you know, unfortunately, like in every aspect of the UFO phenomenon, you do occasionally get the odd hoax. You know, somebody wants to turn up in a UFO conference dressed in black and act in a sinister fashion, you know, just for a bit of attention. And that might be, you know, be a cause of a few reports that have endured, but not for the most part. So there have been cases where, you know, the Men in Black turn up and they threaten people not to talk about their experiences. When they do that, they often do it in a very couched way, you know, rather than saying, if you don't shut up, we'll kill you. You know, they kind of do it in a way where people think, well, you know, did he just threaten me? But yeah, there have been cases where they've confiscated photographs, drawings that people have made, notes that they might have made, things like that. So that's definitely a pattern. But that kind of brings me to one thing that I didn't sort of focus on too much, and that is sort of the nature of the experience where, as I said, people open the doors to them at midnight. I'm sure everybody in the room now would think to themselves, there's no way I would do that, but people do. That's how they get in. People have said that, you know, they're interrogated, and the reason why they hand over, you know, documentary evidence is because a lot of them have said they felt their common sense factors and self-will was being taken away from them, as almost like a mind control. And they just handed this material over to them, and then the Men in Black would leave. And of course, by the time they come out of this disoriented state, they're already long gone. And there are other sort of creepy issues when the interrogation's taking place, where, like Albert Bender, the people felt dizzy and strange and disoriented, as if one person actually several people have said this, they felt the Men in Black were almost like a psychic vampire, sort of draining them of energy. And they felt that, with hindsight, the threat was almost like a charade, like a game, and the main thing was to sort of feed on the person, you know, which really kind of goes down sort of more horror, supernatural paths than it does anything to do with conspiracies. So, you know, I guess if people kind of came here thinking, you know, I was just going to talk about people flashing ID cards and, you know, Will Smith, Tommy style, that's not the reality of the real, you know, the way it goes. It's very, very different. And you find the same parallels in whichever country we're talking about, whether it's Canada, whether it's the US, whether it's Puerto Rico, everything's the same. And that's why I said we have these sort of matrix parallels that people have brought up. The idea that some people have said that when they've been visited by the Men in Black, they don't seem self-aware. You know, it's almost as if they are like a three-dimensional or holographic image dispatched and sent out to perform a specific task of silencing people, but they themselves are not necessarily self-aware living entities. You know, they could be something that is sort of a sophisticated creation, if you like. And of course, this brings us to another angle, the so-called alien hybrid angle. If you look back, for example, into the early years of alien abduction law, if you go back to the early 60s, like, for example, Betty and Barney Hill, you know, this couple driving back from a vacation in Canada, driving through New Hampshire, they see this light, looks like a craft. Then after a while, you know, they realise when they get home there's missing time. They start to have weird dreams. Well, when Betty and Barney were hypnotised, you know, there was this component of being taken on board, medical procedures, and to a small degree there was like a reproductive sexual component to it as well. Now that really continued at sort of like a under the radar level to a degree through the 60s and 70s. There weren't that many reports, but certainly in the 80s, you know, it sort of rocketed. And we had more of the sort of, like the reproductive sexual components developing significantly in the 80s. Then through the 90s onwards, we started to hear these stories of sort of people, abductees, seeing so-called hybrid children and hybrid babies. as if they were trying to create, the aliens, trying to create sort of like a crossbreed species. And all this brings us to the Men in Black, where many witnesses have said they kind of suspected that these things were sort of half human and half alien. They looked somewhat like us, but they had this sort of the very pale skin and the wraparound glasses. A number of witnesses have said that if the Men in Black have sort of sat close enough and they've looked closely at the glasses, they could see the eyes are much bigger than normal, which possibly, pushes things down the hybrid pathway. And I mean, this is something that, like, for example, Dr. David Jacobs has talked about, the idea of some sort of alien race literally trying to infiltrate us. And by the term infiltrate, Dr. Jacobs does mean from like a sinister perspective, like a takeover perspective. And you can, place the Men in Black in that category. They look odd. They wear the pulled-down hats. They wear the glasses. They're doing, and the collars are up sometimes on the coast. They're doing everything they can to prevent people from getting a good look at their faces. Like with the black-eyed children, they knock on the door. They've got their hoodies up, and they're looking down like that when they're talking to people. So, are we dealing with an infiltration? I don't know, but I think it's sort of a case of all bets are off. It could go in multiple directions. And I actually don't think, as I said at the beginning, that there could just be one answer to all this. I think we could be looking at multiple different types of MIB. Some of them could be government, some of them could be paranormal in some fashion, and maybe some of them really are supernatural, time travelers, who knows? I mean, it would be, granted, stretching things a bit too far to assume that all these categories are valid, but I think they should all potentially be considered at least while we're trying to find the answers.
I was wondering how many confirmed sightings or documented sightings of MIB, how many there were, if there's a number?
Well, I can tell you for sure that I've got probably around about 200 altogether, mainly from the US, but that's because I'm based in the US, but quite a few from England where I used to live. I said some from Puerto Rico, Mexico, different places. Now, Brad Steiger, Brad's got hundreds. Ray Boucher, the guy I mentioned, I know that Ray's got more than 1,000. So, we're probably looking in the reported cases, at least the low to, 2,000 to 5,000, I would think something like that. However, bear in mind that most people who see UFOs, as far as we know, don't report the reports, or the sightings. So it could be the same with the Men in Black. And even I can understand this. I mean, most people might not want to go up to someone and say, hey, at midnight last night, 3 little guys dressed in black turned up on the door. A lot of people don't want to talk about this because there's the ridicule factor, and it does sound really weird. So it wouldn't surprise me if, obviously I can't give a percentage, but it wouldn't surprise me if there was a massive number of sort of silent MIB witnesses who just think, if I talk about this, people are just going to think I'm crazy, so they just decide not to say anything. And maybe that's the whole point of the experience. The Men in Black create so much of this weirdness because they know that if people talk about it, so many people are going to say, well, you've overdosed on watching Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, So it's a good tactic in that respect. Well, my personal view is, as I said, as far as the theme of the conference, what does the government know? I think a small percentage could have been government people, but bearing in mind, as I said, back in the 50s they wore fedoras and the black suits, so they could have been interpreted as Men in Black. But for me, as the weirder Men in Black, however we define what the supernatural is or the world of the paranormal, I think that's what they are. I wish I could give you answers as to what the paranormal realm is, but I think whatever it is, that's where the MIB come from. They're not coming out of the Pentagon, they're not. But the challenge is on to try and find out where they're from. So.
By paranormal, are you saying that are you connecting this with an extraterrestrial?
Well, yeah. I actually am, because I mean there are a lot of UFO reports that do have sort of paranormal overtones to them. You know, sometimes people have had UFO experiences and they've developed significant psychic powers afterwards. The whole issue of synchronicities, you know, if it's just about nuts and bolts, somebody else's equivalent of NASA, how can that cause so many people to have synchronicities? It can't. You know, there's got to be something else going on, a bigger issue. You know, because I mean, most people in ufology, I would hazard a guess to say, have had weird synchronicities at some point or another. And I don't see how, like I said, if it's just nuts and bolts, that can happen. It wouldn't. So I think we need to look at the UFO subject from a broader perspective that goes beyond just, you know, somebody else's equivalent of a space shuttle or whatever. So why doesn't the government tell us? I think one of the reasons, and maybe it's something a lot of people don't necessarily assume, everybody assumes the government's got all the answers, or the agencies have got the answers. I often wonder if they've got a lot of data, a lot of information, but not necessarily a lot of answers. I mean, let's sort of play devil's advocate that, you know, so out of Area 51 there are 25 dead alien bodies, you know, preserved in tanks, and they've got 4 crashed UFOs. Well, what that tells you is that somebody's skulking around, flying about, they've crashed, and we've recovered the material evidence. It doesn't necessarily tell you what their agenda is, where they're from, what they want, or what they want from us, or what they're going to use us for. All it tells us is that somebody else is around. And I wonder if that's the position the government's in. They've got material evidence, but they may be as in the dark as we are as to what the agenda is. And perhaps it's the fear of saying, not so much the fear of revealing what they know, the fear of saying we actually don't know. We know something's going on, but we have no answers. That might actually disturb some people. You know, they turn to the government for answers, and the government says, we're as much in the dark as you are. That's why we've said nothing. Governments often take this sort of approach, well, you know, we're the government and you're just the population, so shut up. You know, and it's almost like an arrogant approach that, well, we're not going to tell you. We're going to keep it this sort of elite little secret, which, you know, I don't think should be the case. We should know. Even if, I mean, very quickly, last thing, for years we all lived under the threat of nuclear war, you know, at the height of the Cold War, but we didn't panic every day. We just hoped it never happened. So even if there's some disturbing aspects to the UFO phenomenon, we'd still live with it. You know, we'd still get up and go to work and watch American Idol or whatever, you know. We just hope that if there was a bad side to it, it would never happen. So I think it is something we should be told. You know, I'm not sure whether disclosure will work or if it's going to happen, but I do think we should be told the truth.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you once again, Nick Redfern, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thanks.